his introduction, so I appreciate that. That was very kind of you. It's great to be here, and I think this conference is a really special thing, and I think that Matt and the church, Gospel Fellowship, have started something that's really a jewel in our area. So I hope you continue to come, and I hope you also continue to promote it with your friends. So this is really I think it's really a fabulous event. So let's keep it going, and let's keep it growing. It'd be great to see this event continue to prosper. Well, I do want to think today about marriage and divorce, and I decided that since I'm coming to a confessional church to do a conference, and I'm confessional, it might be a good idea to take this broad topic and think about it confessionally. And so I want us to think about it as it relates to chapter 24 of the Westminster Confession. Now, when we think about the Westminster Confession, I think it's a good thing for us to maybe start with a step back and then walk a little closer to the teaching of the Westminster Confession as it relates to marriage and divorce. So I'm going to do that. I want us to think, first of all, about the structure of the Westminster Confession, and then I want to contextualize our particular topic today. Before I go any further, can you folks hear me in the back? Am I loud enough? Yep. Okay, great. Okay, so let's think about the structure of the Westminster Confession for just a minute, and let's just think about some ideas that relate to the structure. I'm not going to take and go through the whole thing. I want to say a few things, give you an example of what I mean, and then help you look at the section that we're in. First of all, I want you to know that when you look at the Westminster Confession, it's cumulative. It's built to build upon itself. So it's front-loaded, we might say. The Westminster Divines put a lot of basic and foundational and architectonic concepts right into the beginning chapters on the doctrine of Scripture, the decrees, God, and so on, in order for us to draw down on them later on in the text. And so really what you find is that the Westminster Confession builds upon itself. And as you move throughout the confession, as you get further along in the confession, you are expected to remember what you read previously. So it builds upon itself. The second thing I want you to know is it's federal in its orientation. It's federal in its orientation. Now, what do I mean by it's federal? What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it is built on a covenant structure. It's built on a covenant structure. Now, you may say, well, what do you mean a covenant structure? Well, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When I say it's built on a covenant structure, you might think about the covenantal phrase, I will be your God and you will be my people. Now, when you take the section having to do with soteriology, having to do with salvation, you're going to see that very explicitly. Let me show you what I mean. You may not be able to see this for those of you who are in the back, but I'll try to do my best to say, Barry can probably see it, but no one else can. This is the Westminster Confession itself, and what we have here are chapters 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So we start the section on soteriology with freedom of the will, and then obviously that sets us up for effectual calling, justification, adoption, sanctification, and then what comes next? Chapters 14 and 15 on saving faith and repentance. Now, if you just stop to think about that for a minute, you'll say to yourself, well, that seems a little odd, especially when I think about the typical Ordo Salutis, the typical order of salvation. And G.I. Williamson certainly thought that when he wrote his commentary on the Westminster Confession, because what he did was he said, let's take chapters 14 and 15, and let's just insert them between chapters 10 and 11, because that's obviously where they belong when we think of a typical Ordo Salutis. It goes effectual calling, conversion, i.e., repentance and faith, and then justification. And it naturally goes in that direction. Why? Because faith receives justification. And so chapter 11 is justification, chapter 12 adoption, and so on. Now, why is it that the Westminster Confession arranged these topics in this way, at least as it pertains to soteriology? Well, the answer is simple. It's covenantal. It's federal in its approach to its soteriology. In other words, you can see the covenantal phrase, I will be your God. This is what God does as he is our God. And then you will be my people. And this is what we do as we are the people of God. Now, G.I. Williamson said, let me help you understand this in terms of its logical flow, and so that's why he rearranges. But when you look at the Westminster Confession, there's a structure here. It's built on a structure, and that structure is important. So first of all, it's cumulative, it's covenantal, it's federal, and then it's comprehensive. It's comprehensive. Now, what do I mean by it's comprehensive? Well, when you look at the Westminster Confession, one of the things that you discover is that it really does cover the different areas of life. And let me show you what I mean by that. First of all, everything grows out of the law of God that we find in 19 and 20. But then this particular section on the law of God, chapter 19 and 20, begin a section that really encompasses the church, government, and the home. And so what we find is we find these three sections covered up to chapter 24. Chapter 24 is dealing with marriage and divorce. And so from chapter 19 through 24, we get this idea that the law of God governs all the spheres of life, whether they be our religious practice, our civic duties, or our home management. That's the idea. So that's where we are when we think about the Westminster Confession of Faith, and so that's where we are when we come to chapter 24 of the Westminster Confession. That's its context, that's its setting. And if you have any questions about that, you can ask them at the end. And I'm going to try to leave some time for questions at the end, probably 30, 25 seconds. Something like that, in that general vicinity. Let me give you my breakdown for how we're going to look at chapter 24 of the confession. And again, I realize it's written very large, so you'll be able to see it very clearly. These are the participants. We're going to look at the purpose in section 2. We're going to look at some principles that are given in section 3, some prohibitions in section 4, the parting in section 5. The parting in section 5 is obviously the idea of divorce. We're going to look at divorce there. And then we're going to look at some precautions in chapter 6. And so that's going to be our basic breakdown of chapter 24 of the confession. So the first section that we're going to look at are the participants of the Westminster Confession. I realize I'm so thankful to Matt. I walked off, didn't bring a projector or screen or anything, and last minute he was able to put something together for me, and so I'm very appreciative of that. At least it's in front of you. We're going to be working with the Westminster Confession.
We have the handouts too if you want.
Oh, do you have handouts? Look at this guy. Man, thank you so much. We've got handouts. So here's the text of the confession, and so you'll have it right in front of you as we go. That's terrific. I didn't realize you made, once we got the TV, I didn't realize you had made the handouts too. Thank you so much. All right, so I'll give them a chance to put them around. But as I do, let me just read to you the first section of chapter 24. So marriage is to be between one man and one woman. Neither is it lawful for any man to have more than one wife, nor for any woman to have more than one husband at a time. So I want you to think about just some of the things that are here as they flow out of the Westminster Confession. The first thing I want you to notice is there's a modern application to the Westminster Confession. And what I mean is, what we had to think about a constitutional amendment, in terms of our own country. Remember back when George Bush was in for his second term, George Jr. Was in for his second term. The first thing he did was introduce a constitutional amendment so that marriage would be understood between a man and a woman, and it failed. Remember that? And what he had to introduce a constitutional amendment to fix, the Westminster Confession simply stated over 400 years ago, and that is that marriage is between one man and one woman. And so it's contemporary in its application. It's modern in its application. But we also understand there's something else very simple. It's monogamous in its orientation. It's monogamous. What monogamy means is one marriage or one wedding. Gamos is the word in Greek for wedding or marriage, and mono obviously means one. So one marriage, one wife, one husband. And then notice this. It's not man-centered. It's an equitable document. Not only may a man not have more than one wife, but a wife may not have more than one husband. That was a joke, kind of fell flat, but it's okay. It's a very equitable document. That's a word we like to throw around today in our culture, and so I thought, well, anyway, moving right along. That was all I have for section 1. Got to beg for laughs every once in a while, Seth. That's all you got to do.
You're getting warmed up. Hang on.
What's that?
You're getting warmed up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So section 2. Section 2, we get more into the purpose of marriage. Now, I want to talk to you about a couple of things here that I think are important. But first of all, let me read section 2. Section 2 says, marriage was ordained for the mutual help of husband and wife, for the increase of mankind with a legitimate issue, and of the church with a holy seed, and for preventing of uncleanness. Before I go any further, what time did you say I had until to go through?
You are
15?
until, yeah.
11:15?
Yeah.
Okay.
11:15, yeah.
All right, great. All right, so let me first of all say that when you look at this, you find that we're put together in marriage for mutual help. And you see this mutual help when you look at, say, Ephesians 5:21 and following. What's there? Well, if you take it out and look at it, and I'm not going to take time for us to go there, but let me simply say, you find that a husband is to love his wife, a wife is to submit to her husband, and basically what you find that this text really reverses the curse that you find in Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, we're told that after the fall, the curse that's placed upon Eve and Adam is that her desire will be for her husband and he will rule over her. Now, the ESV changes that a little bit and says her desire will be contrary to her husband and he will rule over her. But the idea is the same. The idea is that the wife will desire to usurp her husband's place, and he will meet that usurpation with an ungodly domination. And so there will always be conflict in the marriage, and you find that conflict expressed in Genesis chapter 3. But in Ephesians chapter 5, you find a reversal of that curse. How so? Well, here, the wife is no longer trying to usurp, she's submitting, and the husband is no longer dominating, he's loving. And so what you get is a beautiful reciprocity. And I don't know, our world really does sort of look down on that whole thing of submitting and loving. But I want to tell you something. When a husband is loving his wife, a wife wants to submit to his loving leadership. And when a husband sees his wife's submission, her loving submission, her respectful submission, he longs to lead her in a loving way. It's reciprocal. And the fact of the matter is, as you look down through Ephesians, you see that mutual help that the confession talks about flowering up. And what I mean by that is that the wife and the husband really become more sanctified not only in their relationship one to another, but individually as they live together in this kind of mutual harmony, in this kind of mutual help. And so really the confession is talking about this mutual help, not just in the sense that he won't help me wash the dishes and she won't help me change the oil on the car, but in the sense that we grow in Christ together. And that's what's in view here. The second thing I want you to notice is this. The confession talks to us about sex. It talks to us about the increase of mankind. Now, I think that what we have here is this general idea that there's, and maybe we can even put this under the cultural mandate, to be fruitful and multiply, not necessarily aimed at the church per se, but just in general, marriage is good for the multiplication of the human race. And the reason I say that I think the confession makes this difference is because of what you find next. What you find next is the holy seed. And this is for the church. In other words, this is church growth. We're talking now about husbands and wives who are in the Lord growing the church of Jesus Christ. And I have down here 1 Corinthians 7:14, which is that passage that we'll look at a little bit later, that talks about even a believing spouse married to an unbelieving spouse. Well, the children are holy because of that believing spouse, and holy in the federal sense, that is, that they are in the sphere of the covenant. They are exposed to the covenantal benefits that mom lives out or dad lives out, whichever one happens to be a believer. And they are entitled to the sign of the covenant, baptism, and so forth. So there's certainly the idea of church growth, the idea of a holy seed, propagation of the church, that sort of thing. We should never disparage that. We should never disparage that. And sometimes we do, I think. We say, especially as Presbyterians, boy, I wish we had more adults coming into the church. We may wish that, and we should wish that, and see adult baptisms. But I want you to know something. It is never good for us to disparage moms and dads having children in the church, and those little children being our littlest disciples. Never disparage that. So, but then I want you to know this. It's for sanctification. Now, this is important for, I think, those who are thinking about marriage, and I think it's important for those who are married. What do I mean? I mean that this text tells us that marriage is good for preventing uncleanness. Now, that's a nice way to say it, but what it's teaching us is that marriage is good to satisfy those sexual desires that we have. And if those sexual desires can't be tamed and restrained, then marriage is a good place to go. It's a good outlet. Now, I want you to know something. I think that this is one of those places where husbands and wives hit the rocks. It's one of those places where, as we get a little further into the confession, we find out why there are reasons to be tempted. This is a good lesson to learn right up front. This text, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 9, tells us that if you burn with desire, then you ought to be married. And then it also goes on to share some really practical advice. And that practical advice is that a husband and a wife have no authority to withhold themselves from one another unless it's by mutual consent. And here's the wisdom, and for a time, for the purpose of something like prayer, and then come back together again, lest you be tempted by Satan. Boy, that's a powerful piece of practical advice. It really is, and it ought to be heeded. You know what I tell young people who are coming to me when we do premarital counseling? I tell them a simple piece of advice. I tell them one of the things that you need to do early on in your marriage is establish a schedule for sexual intimacy. And they say, well, why? Do you think we'll need that early? No, I don't think you'll need that early. And sometimes one of the partners will say to me, well, what about spontaneity? I said, there are days off for spontaneity. That was another joke. Anyway. Has it been like this all weekend? Anyway. have to get my composure again. So I tell them, it's not always going to be like this. I mean, you're going to have children, and your wife's going to be tired. You're going to be tired. You're going to be working and coming home. And guess what? You're not going to be attentive and attuned to one another's needs. And if you're not following a schedule, getting into a pattern, getting to know one another and know the needs of the other, then what's going to happen is you're going to provide opportunities for drift and temptation, and it's never a good thing. I want to tell you something. You want to create a wedge within your marriage early on, or a year into it, or 2 years into it. This will do it. Not just your in-laws, not just your finances, but this will do it. And so this is a wise piece in the confession, and it's reflected in the scriptures, or I should say the scriptures are reflected in the confession. So that's the purpose. So we've got support and sex and seed and sanctification. The principles that are here in the confession are very important, but let me read to you section 3. It is lawful for all sorts of people to marry who are able with judgment to give their consent, yet it is the duty of Christians to marry only in the Lord. And therefore such as confess the true Reformed religion should not marry with infidels, papists, or other idolaters. Neither should such as are godly be unequally yoked by marrying with such as are notoriously wicked in their life, or maintain damnable heresies. Now, the first thing is a basic criteria for the world. All sorts of people are able to marry with judgment to give their consent. Now, that seems rather basic, but even in my own pastoral experience, I was pastoring a church, and there was a couple of the world, not members of the church, who were living together beside the church, and the boyfriend and I had motorcycles in common, so we would talk once in a while. And he didn't wear a helmet one day and hit his head, and he ended up in a cognitive psych unit after he came out of his coma, and he never was right after that. But while he was in his coma, the girlfriend called me and said, "Would you come?" And I of course went, and she met me at the door, and her first request was, "Will you marry us?" And I said, "He's unconscious." And she said, "So?" And I said, I can't do that. I mean, you just can't do that, right? But people think that way. And so we have here this idea of able to make a judgment and give consent. So that's the criteria for the world. But then the important thing for us, anyway, is the criteria for the believer. They are to marry only in the Lord. A believer is to marry only in the Lord. A believer is to marry only in the Lord. A believer. Should I say it a couple more times? Maybe 2 more times. Yeah, a believer is to marry only in the Lord. This is foundational, and we mess it up. And I don't know how this happens, but it happens all the time. I'll never forget, I was out evangelizing one evening and ran into a young man. We got to talking, and he told me that he was married to an unbeliever. He had to read his Bible at work. And I said, did you get converted after you got married? And he said, no. And I said, did you marry her? Did you, as a believer, marry her? And he said, yeah. And I said, why? And he looked at me like I was the dumbest person in the world. He said, because I love her. But it happens all the time, but it shouldn't. It shouldn't happen. And then it goes on to tell us some very specifics. We shouldn't marry infidels, which I think are Muslims or other pagans here. No papists. I don't care what Federal Vision says. I don't care what Doug Wilson says. No papists. Okay? No idolaters. And then this. No professor who is not a possessor. In other words, this guy here who is notoriously wicked in his life or holds damnable heresies and yet professes faith in Christ, he is not on the eligible list. Okay? Like, he is not. And so he is a professor, but he's not a possessor. No married. So the bottom line is, don't be unequally yoked. Don't be unequally yoked. That's important. And those are the principles. So the main ones, the criteria for the believer is to marry only in the Lord. Don't be unequally yoked. And then we move to the prohibition. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time with the prohibition. If you want a really fascinating scholarly treatment of this subject, get Barry Waugh's PhD dissertation called "The History of a Confessional Sentence," and you'll have all you want to know about this particular topic. But let me first of all read the topic to you, section 4. Marriage ought not to be within the degrees of consanguinity or affinity forbidden in the Word, nor can such incestuous marriages ever be made lawful by any law of man or consent of parties, so as those persons may live together as man and wife. The man may not marry any of his wife's kindred nearer in blood than he may of his own, nor the woman of her husband's kindred nearer in blood than of her own. Now, when I told you about Barry Waugh's PhD dissertation, that confessional sentence is the last sentence in Article 4. That last sentence in Article 4 is excised by the American editions of the confession. Sometimes if you have an American edition, it just won't even have that last sentence. For instance, the RPCNA will have the original confession, and alongside of it, it will have a testimony. And in our testimony, it will say, like the American confessions that sometimes just leave the sentence out, it will say, the RPCNA does not hold to this sentence, this last sentence any longer. So as Americans, we don't hold to the last. As American Presbyterians, the last sentence is not on the table for us. But let me talk to you a little bit about this section. First of all, the question is, what is consanguinity? And consanguinity has to do with bloodlines, has to do with blood relationships. But what does affinity have to deal with? Affinity has to deal with marriage lines, the proximity of relation regarding marriage. Consanguinity has to do with the proximation of relationship regarding bloodlines, affinity regarding marital lines. Now, this came into play because it was in the memory of the Westminster Divines when they wrote this document, and that had to do with Henry VIII. Let me show you what Henry VIII's argument was for annulling, for him petitioning the papacy to annul his marriage to Catherine so that he could marry Anne Boleyn. Henry VIII's famous argument went like this. He argued for the annulment of his marriage to Catherine on the grounds that there was too close a bloodline between himself and his brother, consanguinity, to permit a biblical marriage to his brother's widow, that is, affinity. So he was not only arguing that affinity comes into play, and so I should have this annulment, but he was arguing that not only is this my sister-in-law, but that was my brother. So on both counts, he was arguing, and he was arguing just because he thought Anne Boleyn could provide him with a male heir and Catherine couldn't. Well, then the American church basically says the last sentence is off the table for us. Now, there are theologians who provide some not flimsy arguments for keeping the last sentence in there, And John Murray would be a guy that would come along and offer an argument in his book, Principles of Conduct. So if you'd like to see a defense of the last sentence, check out Principles of Conduct. Look at John Murray. And he's going to offer, I think, an argument that is good. I'm not sure it's compelling, but I'll leave that for you to decide. Well, let's get to the parting. And we've run out of time, so why don't we just, no, just kidding. So let's look at section number 5. Section number 5 is adultery or fornication committed after a contract being detected before marriage giveth just occasion to the innocent party to dissolve that contract. In the case of adultery after marriage, it is lawful for the innocent party to sue out a divorce, and after the divorce to marry another, as if the offending party were dead. Well, let me say a couple of things about this. First of all, this is a different culture. Here we find talk about a contract before marriage. And we just don't have that. Not that kind of culture. You may choose to think differently, and therefore you may choose to think, for instance, that engagement, a broken engagement, is a divorce that disqualifies someone from ever marrying again. You may choose to believe that and so live your life according to that. But that's not the way that modern American Reformed Presbyterians have thought. That's something that is, I think, cultural about the Westminster Confession. So there's certainly a different cultural aspect here that we need to take into account. However, the same institution is brought before us when they tell us after marriage. So after marriage, we need to pay attention to what's being said here. After marriage, in the case of adultery, after marriage, it is lawful for the innocent party to sue out a divorce, and after the divorce, to marry another, as if the offending party were dead. I just want to stop for a minute, and I want us to think just about a couple of things. First of all, I want to remind you of what the basic position is. The basic position is that God hates divorce. And we see that in the scriptures. That's not something that's hidden from our eyes. It's very clear in Malachi 2:16. And if you use the ESV, it's very clear in the footnote. I'm just saying. You'll find that funny, and maybe not so funny when you think about it later and check out the ESV. But God hates divorce. But not only that, what we find everywhere in the scriptures is that there's a permanence to marriage. Marriage is meant to be permanent. Okay? Marriage is meant to be permanent. Now, let's continue on and think about in the case of adultery for just a few minutes. Let's think about the logic. In the case of adultery, the text says, one may sue for divorce. In other words, when we think about the one exception that Jesus gives us in the Gospels, that exception is reason for a person to sue for divorce. Now, the Westminster Confession goes further. They say not only is adultery grounds, or I want you to know it's not just adultery, it's adultery and fornication. It's a broader idea than just adultery. But in the case of adultery or fornication, one may sue for divorce. The innocent party, the party who sued for the divorce because of the adultery or the sexual immorality, may remarry. Why? Because it is if the offending party is dead. Okay? It's as if the offending party is dead. Now, I want to take a foray into the scriptures and think about a couple of texts. Obviously, we're not going to be able to deal with all the texts. We're not going to be able to deal with Matthew 5 and 19 and Mark 10 and Luke 16 and put them all together. That would be a whole separate talk and maybe series of talks. But what I want us to do is just take a look at a couple of places in Matthew's gospel. And the reason I want us to look at Matthew's gospel is because when we look at Matthew's gospel, we see something very similar to what we find in Mark 10 and Luke 16. But what we also find is an extension. We find Jesus' exception clause. And so Matthew's a good place for us to look if we're going to look at something like this in summary fashion. So first of all, let's look at Matthew chapter 5 and verses 31 and 32. And I'll just read it to you. It says, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. All right, let's just think about a few things related to this text. First of all, I want you to notice that what is in mind is Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. You've heard that it was said, and then Deuteronomy 24 comes into play. Now, Deuteronomy 24, when you think about it, all it says in terms of prohibition is this. All it says is that if a husband gives his wife a certificate of divorce and she marries another, he may not then later marry her again. That's all the prohibition says. That's all there is to the prohibition. Okay, that's in the background. The second thing is this. Jesus says, but I say to you. But I say to you. He says, everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality. Now, except on the ground of sexual immorality is porneia. Now, I happen to think that the confession is right at this point. This word for porneia is a broader word and encompasses more than just a single thing. Now, I should also say this to you. It's important. This is not, some who like to take a very limited view of remarriage say that what Jesus is talking about here is not marriage, but within the contractual period. As they look at the Westminster Confession, they say, what's being forbidden is that contractual period prior to marriage, like Mary and Joseph were in. That contractual period is what's in play here. Now, I want to contest that because what I would say is as soon as you bring Deuteronomy 24 into play, you're not talking about a contractual period, you're talking about marriage itself. So this is a text not dealing with the contractual period prior to marriage. This text is dealing with marriage. We have here an exception for divorce within the context of marriage, not the contractual period. So that's first. I think Deuteronomy 24 makes that untenable, that position untenable. Well, let's pursue this a little bit further. Deuteronomy 24, what am I doing? What happened? I don't know what happened there. But I must have done something. Anyway, notice this. But I say to you, verse 32, that everyone who divorces his wife except on the ground of sexual immorality makes her commit adultery. Now, here's the question we have to ask ourselves. How so? How is it that a husband commits adultery and now the wife is an adulteress? The innocent party is an adulteress, either by staying with him or divorcing him. She's an adulteress. How is that? Well, I think one of the difficulties here has to do with translation. The text, the ESV, is trying to bring into focus that this is a passive. In other words, when you think about the passive voice in the Greek language, that means that something is happening to the subject. And so you see that here. makes her commit adultery. That's the idea of the passive. She's not actively committing adultery. She's made to be an adulteress. But I think that's, now that's a possible way of rendering the passive here. But I also think that you could render it makes her suffer adultery. So makes her suffer adultery. Now think about this for just a minute. The husband commits adultery. The wife suffers adultery. She suffers because of adultery. But then notice what happens. And whoever divorces and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now it extends to her. Let's say her husband divorces her for a reason other than adultery. She's alone. She suffers adultery. Why? Because she's placed in a temptation to remarry, and if she remarries, she commits adultery. I think that's what Matthew 5:31, 32 are talking about. I think that's the now you got to keep that in mind, because let's move to Matthew 19, 1 through 12. And this is the exception. This is the exception clause. It's broader than that. I want to focus on verse 9. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Now, think about this. In 5:31 and 32, the focus was on the innocent party's remarriage. The woman who didn't commit sin but was innocent in it all. Remember, she becomes an adulteress if she remarries because her husband divorced her for something other than sexual immorality, or she sued for divorce for something other than sexual immorality. She becomes an adulteress if she remarries. But here the focus is not on the innocent party. The focus is on the guilty party's remarriage. The focus is on the guilty party's remarriage. And so what we have here is if the guilty party divorces and remarries, he, what? Commits adultery. Let's use he, right, just for the sake of argument. And so what you have in 5 is the innocent party, and what happens to them. Here in 19, you have the guilty party. Now, I'll tell you what this doesn't say. What this doesn't say, nothing is said about whether or not the innocent party may remarry if divorce is grounded on the exception. In other words, if divorce is grounded on the exception, then I think we're not given guidance, but I think remarriage is permissible. John Murray, in his great book called Divorce, which is a series of articles put together from Westminster Confession, says that there is no teaching here on this, but the assumption is that the innocent party or he may remarry. Well, you can ask questions about that afterwards if you'd like, but let me hasten on to the precautions. Although the corruption of man may be such as is apt to study arguments, unduly to put asunder those whom God hath joined together in marriage, yet nothing but adultery or such willful desertion as can no way be remedied by the church or civil magistrate is cause sufficient of dissolving the bond of marriage, wherein a public and orderly course of proceeding is to be observed, and the persons concerned in it not left to their own wills and discretion in their own case. Well, first of all, man doesn't change. Milton sought arguments to put marriage asunder for reasons other than the ones given in the gospel. It's just an interesting historical aside. Here seems to be another exception, though, and the other exception is willful desertion. That is, of course, developed for us in 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 16. I think the argument is basically this. I think the argument is this is Jesus teaching in the context of someone wanting to put away their spouse, and then Paul brings it into a different context, into a context where not a spouse wants to put away their spouse, but a spouse departs from the marriage. It's an entirely different frame of mind. In the Gospels, it was one who wants to put away. In the letter to the Corinthians, it's one who wants to go away. Okay, so it's a different context. So we find it there. And in verse 15 especially, we read these words, "But if the unbelieving partner separates, if they go, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved." And so I think that you can, again, ask me questions about this if you'd like when we get there. But I think here's another reason, different frame of context, not only what I just said, but also Jewish, this Gentile, but now Paul's dealing with Jesus' teaching in a very particular way in a new context. But let me say something, just a couple things about more about this paragraph. First of all, the confession is wise. It says that people are not to be left to their own wills and discretion in their own cases. Now, I don't know about you, but anybody, forget marriage, anyone who has ever come under church discipline thinks that they are their own best advisor in their case. All of a sudden, they are not the unwise person who has made a sinful decision. They are the wisest person to deal with themselves and to guide their own disciplinary case. And the Westminster Confession is so wise at this point. It just reminds us that this person who is wise in their own eyes, who thinks that they're the best counselor for themselves, is not. And that's true of people who are on the rocks of divorce as well. And then, who may help in that situation? Well, of course, the church and the civil magistrate. I want you to know the civil magistrate does not help when it provides no-fault divorce and that kind of thing. Neither does the church. And then the divorce is to be public and orderly. Well, I realize that we are at 11:15, and there's no time for questions. And so thank you very much. I don't know, is there time for questions? That's maybe not.
We're due back up in the sanctuary in 15 minutes, and that means you can use your time wisely. You could go grab another snack, another coffee if you'd like to. You could ask Dr. Stivason a question perhaps as an aside, or you can use the restrooms on the way up. I can't quite tell by listening if they're done up there or not, but let's be sensitive to the fact that their seminar may still be winding down. So why don't we say one or two questions?
Okay.
And then let's give at least 10 minutes for people to grab a coffee.
Sounds great.
Okay.
One or two questions?
Does the Westminster Confession assume unrepentant adultery or just a blanket? I come from a Baptist background, so I'm not real familiar, but is it an assumption that they're unrepentant? What if they do repent from that?
The assumption is that they are unrepentant, and if they are unrepentant, that's why the declaration of their deadness is brought to bear. If they are repentant, hopefully there's reconciliation that can take place. However, the innocent party may sue for divorce, even if there is repentance.
Wow, okay.
I think people get married, commitment marriage. I understand what that's about.
Well, that's oftentimes so that they can avoid, in their elderly years, being subject to the IRS. I really think.
So one of the things that is not generally put in as an exception, and you didn't bring up, but people question the church on, is what if you have a spouse who is violent?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that what if you have a spouse who is violent?
Which is not my case, by the way.
What if you have a spouse who is violent? And certainly, I think there is a place for the elders to counsel a woman to come out of that situation, and for them to seek reconciliation. I think that's first step. Get her out. Get some help going, and then I think some people then ask the question, well, what if there's no repentance on the part of the husband? Well, at that point, I think that what can come into play is church discipline. And if church discipline comes into play at that point because of violence and anger and things like that, and he's excommunicated, then I think the conclusion of that is the same as what we found. He's dead to her in that sense. And so the same result can ensue. That's my own view on it. Somebody else may have a tighter.
So it's abandonment in the end.
So it's abandonment. And last one.
When you mention about the whole adultery thing, would somebody who is placing pornography over their spouse, would that count as adultery?
Okay, that's a great question. And I think the Sermon on the Mount deals with that. There are people who would say pornography is cause for, divorce. I think if pornography is cause for divorce, I want to make one qualification. I think if pornography is cause for divorce, then you can use the Sermon on the Mount to say that calling your brother a fool is cause for the death penalty. Right? I think the logic doesn't hold up. I think some women are so frustrated with their husband's addiction that they just want out. And I don't think there's a way to get out. Now, having said that, I realize that there are gradations of what that may mean. And that may mean that the gradations may mean they may come to church discipline and excommunication. And so it may in the end work out. But I don't think that you can catch your husband's screen, and say, "Oh, I've got cause for, adultery, grounds for adultery. I'm divorcing my husband." I don't think it's that easy. There are more gradations and church intervention and that sort of thing that has to happen. Okay, thanks for being a great audience. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.